Okay, so top of 21, Stanley says, they won't come. Someone's taking the Michael. Forget all about it. It's a false alarm. It's a false alarm. And again, he's trying to reassure himself here. One thing to say, first of all, taking the Michael means being wound up, someone being sarcastic towards you, someone trying to make fun of you. It's actually Cockney slang in English. I think, importantly, this reveals his guilt and his internal conflict at the same time in this particular section of the text, and that self-deception that he becomes so prone to is particularly evident here. And then what he says, this really interesting motif, I think you would call it, for want of a better word, actually. Using the word motif in Pinter is quite complex, but it's both a combination of language and physical theatre here. That Stanley quickly says, "Where's my tea?" So this tea that he's been incredibly sarcastic towards and has been kind of hostile towards Meg by virtue of talking about tea throughout the scene so far, he suddenly reverts that, and it's almost like a kind of comfort blanket. He almost wants to go backwards into his little Oedipal burrow with Meg from the previous moments in the scene. And what we see here is, I think, a kind of microcosmic vision of the play itself, in which the tea is Stanley in terms of what later occurs. And it's not strictly, but it borrows that kind of play within a play dynamic where it's a piece of action, a theatrical set piece that I think replicates the dynamic of its central dramatic narrative. And you'll see what I mean as we look through this. Stanley asks, "Where's my tea?" Meg says, "I took it away, you didn't want it." So there's this very quick assumption here about why the tea's been taken from him, that mirrors his own kind of abduction, if we're going to call it that, by Goldberg and McCann. "What do you mean you took it away?" "I took it away." There's no progress in the dialogue, and again, that mirrors what happens, the absurd nature of what happens to Stanley, in the sense that Stanley is asking her what she means by "take it away," and Meg simply repeats the words back to him, so there's no clarification of the reasons why and what the nature of this being taken away is. And that, again, mirrors what occurs to Stanley later on in the play. "Why did you take it? What did you take it away for? You didn't want it." "Who said I didn't want it? You did." So we've got this paranoia here in these lines about the reasons for the abduction of the tea, if we're going to call it that, with tongue in cheek. But there's no rationale here other than Meg's presumptions about what has led to this tea being taken away. But of course, Stanley has been incredibly critical of the tea throughout, but he seems to be interpreting this as a violation of his rights and his freedoms. And we know that he's prone to this type of thinking because the reason for his retreat in the boarding house is in some way to get away from society, to get away from social orthodoxy. He says, "Who gave you the right to take away my tea? You wouldn't drink it." So his use of the tea, which is lacking in purpose, I think, is actually an expression of his freedom. So he doesn't drink the tea or really want it, but he becomes bothered by this because it's a violation of his own right to do as he pleases with his tea. And it almost mirrors the nature of his retreat from society, is that his engagement with society is purposeless. He can't function in society and amongst social orthodoxy. But at the same time, he has a right as an individual to choose to not be part of it or to be part of it. And he has expressed that freedom by coming away to the boarding house on this non-specific, nondescript seaside town. And that expression of freedom is something that Pinter sympathises with. He absolutely does not, I think he wants to make clear to us through this opening scene, sympathise with Stanley's character and his personality, but what he does sympathise with is Stanley's understanding that social orthodoxy is problematic and that he wants to be apart from it in some way. But I think that's what the moral ambiguity is centred around in this opening act, is the fact that he doesn't support Stanley's character and his behaviour and his proclivities, but what he does support is his exercise of freedom and his freedom and liberty as an individual. And that's where the moral ambiguity in the play derives from. So, this moment of paranoia, I think, precipitates this real moment of cruelty and paranoia about his own power that is I think, the most unappealing that Stanley ever is in the scene. He says quietly, "Who do you think you're talking to?" And the alarming thing about this is that he borrows that language of authority by which he is so sort of horrifically tortured later on in the play. Meg uncertainly says, "What? Come here." "What do you mean?" "Come over here." "No." This really heavily foreshadows the theatrical set piece that centres around Stanley sitting down when Goldberg and McCann arrive. There's this sort of tug of war over trying to get him to sit down, which is an admission of subservience and subordinacy that he refuses to do initially, but the moment he does sit down, that is the moment that his interrogation unfolds, and it's the moment that he becomes subject to Goldberg and McCann's influence. And Meg says no as well. And I think it's revealing that sort of instinctive hostility towards coercion. There's a sort of instinct going on with Meg, because she is really no more than a set of instincts, that we resist coercion whenever possible. Stanley says, "I want to ask you something." Meg fidgets nervously. She does not go to it. So she's uncomfortable, but she doesn't know where to turn. "Come on. All right, I can ask you it from here just as well." So she actually refuses to give in to him here, which is important. He says, "Tell me, Mrs. Bowles, when you address yourself to me, do you ever ask yourself who exactly you are talking to, eh?" And there's this really unpleasant moment of him, I think, utilising the uncertainty surrounding his character to try and perform the veneer of an authoritarian figure that really is repugnant to us, because we've seen that he is so lethargic and inert and really resists most of the things that we associate with social orthodoxy and authority. And he knows this, and I think he understands the internal conflict here. He's becoming what he hates and what he's resisted. And it's purely because of his own internal drama that and his own sense of inadequacy that he's behaved in this way. And then we see this in the stage directions. There's silence again. Silence in Pinter is the biggest pause. There's this enormous sense of personal crisis looming in that stage direction. He groans and his trunk falls forward and his head falls into his hand. So there's this a kind of crushing acceptance of defeat, that he has here become what he despises within the space of an act. And it very clearly mirrors Blanche's body language at the end of that very opening scene, where we have that brief dramatic climax in the scene that suggests the internal conflict that's going to drive the narrative forward, of her being reminded of her husband's death through the polka that Williams uses throughout to remind us of Blanche's consciousness and of her recollections of his death and her guilty role in her husband's death. Meg, in a small voice, this is the bit where I feel is one of the most tender moments in the scene, and where I like Meg the most, is she obviously realises there's something not quite right with Stanley, and doesn't have any clue what it is. You know, when we think about the amount of analysis that we've just discussed, looking at this stage direction, obviously none of that's going on in her head, because it's completely besides the point. Didn't you enjoy your breakfast, Stan? You know, she thinks he's having a moment of profound existential crisis because he didn't enjoy his cornflakes. And that misunderstanding, I think, is evident here. His frustration and his sadness in this suffocating atmosphere is in part a product of this isolation that he experiences in these surroundings. And Meg's misunderstanding of his subtext is striking in this moment. And she returns the dialogue back to things that she's familiar with. "Stan, when are you going to play the piano again, like you used to?" And he grunts, "Oh, I used to like watching you play the piano. When are you going to play it again?" And there's this sort of maternal obsession. She really does sound like a mother at that point, being proud of her son for playing a musical instrument. And he grunts because he's fed up of that kind of insular claustrophobic treatment. But the obvious answer that he reveals to her, I haven't got a piano, have I? Well, clearly there's absolutely no way that he could play the piano because he doesn't have one in the building itself. And then Meg says, no, I meant when you were working at piano. What she's talking about and what she's reminded him of here is this, A, the world of employment which he has shunned, but B, the story that he has told her about what he used to do. So this is where we see a dramatic slip in Stanley's characterization, where we see him probably worse, I think, than Meg for his vulnerability to self-deception, and even of Blanche. He's very deluded about his role and his character before coming away to the seaside town. He knows this and tries to get rid of Meg. Go and do your shopping. And Meg says, but you wouldn't have to go away if you got a job, would you? You could play the piano on the pier. So again, what we see here is this quite tender moment, I think, albeit a taboo violation of relationship social norms, that reveals Meg's dependence on him. She is utterly dependent on him and finds in her relationship with him some sense of solace and some sense of intimacy. And this precipitates this sort of dreamy self-deception that Stanley then undergoes here. He looks at her and then speaks airily, and it's very important that we acknowledge that she obviously is the peak of self-delusion, self-deception. We see that in some of the final lines of the play where she says, she was the belle of the ball, and she says, I know I was. And she's desperately trying to reassure herself and falls foul to her own self-deceptions here. But his self-deception here is profound. He speaks airily, and we see this in Pinter's stage directions. I've been offered a job, as a matter of fact. And we can see his own sense of illusion, self-deception, and the fact that he's formulating this story on the spot through the ellipses. What? Yes, I'm considering a job at the moment. You're not. A good one, too. A nightclub in Berlin. And the brevity of those sentences reveal to us that this is a story being formulated on the fly. That self-deception is profound. It's just like Blanche and her self-deceptions about the past and about her identity and her refusal to see the present reality in its true form. It says Berlin, a nightclub, playing the piano, a fabulous salary, and all found. How long for? We don't stay in Berlin, then we go to Athens. And his evasive treatment here shows us the fictionality of this story. How long for? Yes. Then we pay a flying visit to, what's its name? And the fact that his deceptions don't even need to sound real. This is not even, obviously in the presence of Meg, he can sort of afford to be as lax as he wants because he knows that she will believe every word he says. But this is really about how language can be manipulated so readily to delude ourselves about our own role and how easy it is to formulate. She says, where? Constantinople, Zagreb, Vladivostok. It's a round the world tour. And you can see this. The nature of this narrative is that it keeps changing, it keeps shifting as he progresses through it. He keeps adding components to it. And I think that barrage of information that we see in this line here, Constantinople, Zagreb, Vladivostok, it's a round the world tour. Again, it reveals his kind of worldliness, and I think it provides some sense of why he's so frustrated in this insular scenario that he finds himself in. But it also foreshadows the barrage of information that McCann and Goldberg demand from him when they turn up, and it has that absurd, almost endlessly proliferating character where they accuse him of almost everything under the sun that anyone has ever been accused of. And he seems to borrow that dynamic here as he formulates this self-deluding story on the fly. And Meg completely buys it, sitting at the table. Have you played the piano in those places before? Played the piano? I've played the piano all over the world, all over the country. I once gave a concert. And here, the dynamic works in reverse. He begins with his overblown overestimation of what he's done and retracts it. And then that pause here, so classically picturesque, reveals his his delusion and the fact that he now moves to what we could conceive of as something honest. I once gave a concert, retracted all of those grand lies that he's just told me. A concert? And he says reflectively, yes, it was a good one too. They were all there that night, every single one of them. It was a great success, yes. A concert at Lower Edmonton, and immediately he slips back into this surreal self-delusion that in many ways borrows something that we see throughout the play of being uncertain about the motivations and reasoning and cause and effect chains that drive characters' relationships. Pinter will never give us those because it takes away, I think, some of the abstract quality that his narratives and his drama is capable of communicating. He wants us to see these dramatic moments as entirely universal, and this moment of fear and of punishment and abduction as something that translates across a number of different contexts. And Stanley borrows that same intention to deliberately obscure motivation and intent and all of the things that we use to understand why people are behaving. They were all there that night. And the vagueness of his language obviously reveals the dreamy quality of this self-delusion, that everyone was there. But we have absolutely no idea who he's talking about, even in his dream. And that obscuring of motive is really important in creating the abstract qualities of the characters. Every single one of them, every single one of who we don't know. And again, this is precisely the language that Goldberg and McCann use when they come to get him. It was a great success. Yes, a concert at Lower Edmonton. What did you wear? Meg, obviously, in customary fashion, asks him a question that he's absolutely not interested in answering. And he, to himself, I mean, there's a great irony of a dialogue that takes place to himself, and we can see the communicative distance between these two characters so profoundly here. Stanley is in this kind of mesmeric daydream, this fantasy world, and Meg feels like she's participating in it in some way. So in some bizarre fashion, this is a rare moment of where they're both happy, but incredibly distant from each other at the same time. I had a unique touch, absolutely unique. And this is hugely self-absorbed in his delusions. And we've got a comparison with Blanche being invited with us here in this opening scene, the way he is utterly deluded about his own artistic talent and the way that she is utterly deluded about reality itself. And both of them have this sort of aesthetic character that she sees life almost as requiring the complete aesthetic of the noble values of the Old South as an aesthetic entity. And here, his self-delusions involve an aesthetic. They have an aesthetic. They have this kind of improvisational aesthetic, but they are about his artistry, and that he sees his delusion is centered on his own aesthetic abilities, his own artistry, his unique touch, absolutely unique. They came up to me and said they were grateful. What also I think is important here is that this shadows Goldberg's reminiscences. Goldberg is particularly susceptible to a kind of a syrupy, maudlin, self-congratulatory, nostalgic reminiscence about his past. And that's exactly what Stanley's doing here. And I think, again, it connects to Blanche's self-deceptions about the past. Champagne we had that night, the lot. There's a pause. Again, I think exposing his own emotional connection to this memory. There probably is, within this narrative, some kernel of truth, but it's so shrouded in the deceptive nature of his obscure imaginings that we're unable to pin down exactly what that kernel of truth is. My father nearly came down to hear me. Well, I dropped him a card anyway, but I don't think he could make it. No, I lost the address, that was it. And again, you can hear the story exposing its own fictionality. And within that exposure of its fictionality is a point being made about the instability of identity itself and of the past. You know, if we are uncertain about facts of this nature, how can we be even certain who we are and what the past is? We are constantly trying to verify what the past consists of and who we are because of that. And it's utterly unstable in this recollection. But we do, obviously, within there, I think, see that there's some kind of distance between Stanley and his father, and that you know, it leads us, it invites us into that speculatory mode where we're saying to ourselves, oh, well, this is probably the reason why he's in the predicament that he's in. And the pause invites that. There's this huge sense of subtext there that there's a problematic relationship with his father. Yes, Lower Edmonton. Then after that, you know what they did? They carved me up. It was all arranged. It was all worked out. My next concert, somewhere else it was. And again, completely formulating the story on the fly. In winter, I went down there to play. He hasn't even said where. He's not telling us where. And it's important that it doesn't even matter who it is, because what we see in this language is the story possesses a dynamic in the same way that the play possesses a dynamic. But the details are unimportant, because the reason that he's telling himself this story is that it's an imagination. He's trying to experience the feel of the narrative rather than actually verify its accuracy and its veracity. He wants to feel the story, because the feel of the story is what creates the emotions that allow for self-deception. It's not the facts. In winter, I went down there to play. Then, when I got there, the hall was closed, the palace was shut up, not even a caretaker, they'd locked it up. And there's, you know, it has a kind of tragic dynamic, his story. His story's got this sad ending. And he takes off his glasses, which is an important, you know, this does have a symbolic quality. Pinter is very wary of ever writing anything symbolic, but there's a symbolic meaning, I think, to that particular prop and his behaviour towards it, because he takes off his glasses, always shows us that his vision is being compromised. And so the quality that Pinter does admire in Stanley is the way that he sees the nature of social orthodoxy and sees that it's uncomfortably authoritarian and that he tries to resist that. But once he's got his glasses off here, I think it's an admission to us that this story is entirely a compromised vision of reality. A farce one. They pulled a farce one. I'd like to know who was responsible for that. And he says this bitterly. So whether this story is true or not, it has engendered the emotional response that he's hoping for. And the fact that he's telling himself the story is allowing himself to live out this experience. All right, Jack, I can take a tip. They want me to crawl down on my bending knees. Well, I can take a tip. And there's almost a kind of stream of consciousness quality to those lines that shows us that he is absolutely absorbed in his own world there. And he replaces his glasses when it finishes. So he comes back, I think, to some form of reality. And then looks at Meg. Look at her. You're just an old piece of rock cake, aren't you? And he's, again, that sense of inadequacy that this memory has created leads him to be hostile towards her. And it's his own sense of internal conflict about his artistic destiny and the sad, insular life that he's leaving now that generates this hostility on his part. Don't you go away again, Stan. You stay here. You'll be better off. You stay with your old Meg. He groans and lies across the table. And it's almost like he's gone away into his own mind there. He's gone away in his head at that moment in time. And that Meg wants him to stay trapped in this insular reality. And that's the source of this huge conflict that Stanley experiences. How to navigate a sense of fulfillment that he gains from artistic freedom whilst staying clear of society. Aren't you feeling well this morning, Stan? Did you pay a visit this morning? So we've got this, again, this huge sense of crisis that's rendered through inertia. Stanley's inertia is this kind of defining feature in the opening of the text. And for Blanche, it's precisely the opposite. She's a crisis that desires inertia. She wants things to stay the same. So they contrast in that respect too. Stanley says, Meg, do you know what? What? Have you heard the latest? No. I'll bet you have. I haven't. Shall I tell you? What latest? You haven't heard it? No. And here, on the back of that sense of self-inadequacy, he quite literally becomes almost like a prototypical interrogator here. borrowing that sense of disorienting vagueness and using that generic language to provoke Meg into an experience of paranoia and fear. That's exactly what Goldberg and McCann do to him. So there's again an example of proleptic irony in the scene where Stanley is foreshadowing the hostile, interrogative treatment that he is going to be subjected to later on. And this develops to a kind of crescendo in this part here. Stanley's advancing. They're coming today. They're coming in a van. Who? This is a really important piece of foreshadowing in the play. And do you know what they've got in that van? Both of these, all of the language that he uses, the impersonal kind of pronouns and the vague language, it's like a linguistic technique called deixis, D-E-I-X-I-S, where we're uncertain about the reference of grammatical words. We don't know what they refer to. And that is what creates a sense of disorientation and fear in Meg, and it's exactly what Goldberg and McCann do to him. Well, they've got a wheelbarrow in that van. They haven't. Oh yes, they have. You're a liar. And advancing on her. It's a really crucial stage direction that gives him aggressive body language. A big wheelbarrow. And when the van stops, they wheel it out. And they wheel it up to the garden path, and then they knock at the front door. They don't. They're looking for someone. They're not. They're looking for someone, a certain person. And again, he doesn't say who it is, doesn't specify. It creates this enormous sense of suspense that exactly borrows from the dynamic that Goldberg and McCann show. Meg Halsey says, no, they're not. Shall I tell you who they're looking for? No. Meg absolutely doesn't want to know. She wants to stay in the delusion of mystery and a non-affirmation of identity. Meg loves being in that realm. You don't want me to tell you. You're a liar. And then there's a sudden knock at the front door at the end of this dialogue. And this is crucial. This is a crucial part of Pinter's aesthetic, where we have the entirely nightmarishly surreal created with this enormous sense of mystery that Stanley creates through this vague language, interacting with the entirely plausible and entirely realistic, because it's actually Lulu. It's their friend who's come round, ooh, and it's entirely mundane. She ages past Stanley and collects a shopping bag. So there's something entirely mundane and naturalistic and realistic going on in the action, but it's woven into the surreal nightmare that Stanley conjures. And that's precisely what creates the genre tension that this play inhabits between a kind of surrealist, absurdist drama and naturalistic realism. It hovers uncomfortably between the two, very deliberately, in order to disturb the way in which we interpret everyday natural reality and the absence that's at the core of our existence in everyday natural reality. Now, this, I think, the torment that you see in this, and the subtext of this, is the shallow emptiness of self and the emptiness of experience. Of this wielding of power over someone is really the only way that we can register experience as far as we've seen, because all of the dialogue up until this point has really simply registered the absence of emotional authenticity. And this hostile treatment that we see in the dialogue is a compensation for that huge sense of emptiness that is the constituent feature of the human condition in Pinter's argument, and that there's this empty void at the core of our existence. And the only way that we seem to know how to interact with each other is by trying to dominate one another. And that's where the story gets becomes a paradigm for the type of domination that will unfold without a sense of self-knowledge and without the capability of intimacy that self-knowledge promises. So what we see here is a kind of nightmarish vision of what happens if we live through this alienation, and we live through the inability to understand ourselves and attempt to relate to each other without that self-understanding and without the interpersonal intelligence to get a grip on someone else's identity. If we choose, if we live in that way, where we don't want to be known, we want to be alienated from each other, and we carry out these rituals of alienation and isolation, then what we've got coming for us is what we know, and that is either you are the dominant one or you're the one that gets dominated. And we see that in the continual shifting, the oscillation between domination and subordination that we see in this opening act.